All right, we're here, we're queer, and I stopped throwing grenades, so I'm no longer going to be late to the all hands meeting. Welcome to episode 2, a week late on the go to market madness, or whatever the hell we're calling this. I'm Evan, the other one's Dr. Jim, and I'm going to shut up now.
Why? That was one hell of a show launch. Um, I don't
That's
know
what we'll
why you.
call
Yeah, I don't know why you. We should open the show that way every episode.
just me aggressive, very aggressively opening the show.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. We're in the circle of trust.
I sound like a high school bus driver that's just had a really rough week and going through a divorce.
Wow. Do you have a lot of experience talking with high school bus drivers that who are going through divorces?
Actually, yes.
Oh, are you the cause
I
of their
was
divorces?
You know what? In hindsight, I probably could have spun it in a way where I could have been. I maybe encouraged a couple. I was always that kid that was like, all the other 10 or 11-year-olds would be off playing, but at the holiday event, I was always at like the kitchen counter and with drinking a juicy juice going, did the divorce go through, Deborah? I can't even take credit for that joke though. That goes to Naomi Ekperigin. She's an amazing comic. But I always felt more like I wanted to hear the adult drama because that was interesting to me, even at 10. And I think sometimes the adults would unload it on me because I was too young to have any sway. I would just blindly go, yeah, that sounds right.
I don't know. I think our audience that might tune in will be wondering, what is this show about? It seems like we're talking about bus drivers, but I thought this was a marketing and sales show. Like, what are we doing?
No, if my name's on here, there's we're lucky if we get to the topic. Speaking of the topic, this episode, honestly, this whole show is just coming from the love of Evan and Jim's desire to complain on the internet about things. And one of the things that we love to complain about is a lot of founders that focus far too much on product and not enough on distribution. And it's often considered the first time founders curse. That's the mistake that most of them make, is that they focus too much on product, not enough on distribution. Jim, I've been talking a lot already. Would you like to tell the audience, the folks at home and those being held hostage in the car listening to this against their will, what we mean by distribution versus product?
So I think it's a really interesting question when we pose that. What should you focus on as a startup founder? Should you be focused on the product side or the distribution side? And you can often make the case or make the argument that there is no wrong answer. We're actually going to
Mm-hmm.
make the case that there is a wrong answer. But before we dive into like why there's a particular angle that you want to pursue, you have to understand the trade-offs that you have to make as a startup founder or an early stage founder. Because when you think about this distribution versus product choice, you're thinking about a number of other choices that you have to pick from as well. You have to think about brand versus scale. You have to think about experience versus sales. And then you have to think about community versus commodity. And we'll get into those things a little bit throughout the show. But each of those choices and decisions will shape which side of the aisle that you're on. But when you're talking in broad terms about what should you emphasize, should you be focused on distribution or should you be focused on product? Let's take a look at what happens if you do what most early stage founders do, which is obsess about the product. And when you're product obsessed to that degree, the question that you have to ask is, where are you getting the intelligence and the information about what makes a good product from? How are you building that? And that question leads you to the answer of what you should focus on. If you're building your product in a vacuum based on ideas that you've just come up with, and then your circle of friends have validated through their own experience or their own affinity to you, you're going to index on product. But does that really get you traction in the marketplace if you've built it in a vacuum? And that's why we're having this conversation, because the argument is, you said yourself, Evan, second time founders will focus on distribution over product. Distribution is talking about how are you injecting yourself into the customer space and having the customer drive the direction of the product. What are the different channels that you're going to use and tactics that you're going to use to get line of sight into what the customer cares about versus whatever your idea is that you have in your head that you want to drive into the market. So that's really what this conversation is about.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think everybody who has a story, when they're not the founder, but they're working for the founder, they're sitting next to the founder that's in charge of this, and they realize, oh, that's where it went wrong. Like that, you can see that in hindsight. And I hope people also understand too, the founders that I've seen make this mistake, they're far from stupid. They're actually very intelligent. It usually comes from a place of a desire to make sure that's perfect. It's usually coming from a place of like their heart's in the right place with the business, and their intentions are in the right place with like what they're trying to achieve. I think they just they think distribution equals it's ready to be sold, and a lot of startups start selling their product and going to market before the product is actually ready to be sold. But then, because then you're just leaning into the adoption curve. And for those that like aren't marketers or go to market specialists, which honestly I can't imagine that's a lot of you in the audience or at any point in time in the future either for the recordings, but early adopters is a part of the adoption curve. And that's the type of people that buy a product while it's still raw or new, or one could even simplify it as buggy, to use layman's terms. Maybe not completely fleshed out. It's still in development, early stages. Think of it like early stage video games, for example. Think of it as somebody buying a house in a subdivision that's still under construction. Back in the early days of Uber, there were people that were still hesitant to use Uber. They stuck to good old-fashioned cabs because that's what they were used to. Now Uber is so mainstream, I don't think they're marketing to early adopters anymore. I think they're just kind of in the social zeitgeist of humanity, at least in the Western world. The reason I bring up all that is because you need to market to that mindset. A company who's marketing to early adopters knows that they're marketing to early adopters, and the early adopters know that they're early adopters. People are usually self-aware that that's who they are also. So your customers are almost like investors at that point.
So I really love how you brought out the early adopter as the audience when you first start out, because there's an important distinction that we have to draw there as well. One of the big mistakes that happens in the startup's life cycle is you confuse early wins for actual traction. And your point about early adopters is really important in this broader distribution conversation, because what happens is that because you don't have distribution in mind, or you're not really of a distribution mindset, you're in the growth mindset, you confuse those early wins for actual traction and make the wrong assumptions. So one of the things that I always talk about and I always recommend is that your first pick an arbitrary number going from 0 to 100 or 0 to 200, whether that's conversations or customers or whatever. You should be looking at that as a rapid iteration stage of your product. And that's where the early adopter mindset comes in, is that you have to kind of reorient yourself to the thinking that even though I'm getting wins, even though I'm getting conversations, even though I'm getting progress, don't confuse that with actual traction in the marketplace. Your motion in those moments from 0 to 100, 0 to 200, whatever, your focus should be on, why is this happening? What did you like about what I said that encouraged you to talk with me? What did you like about how this was shaped that encouraged you to buy? What was happening within your environment that indicated that this product, which isn't a finished or mature product, was the right fit at the right time? And that's the mindset that gets you in that distribution mindset, because you're indexing towards conversation and intelligence and getting market detail versus taking those signals and taking those wins as an indicator of traction. Because right now, at that stage of product development and your life cycle, you're operating really broadly. So you're going to get customers from all over the place in terms of what they look like, what industries they are, the personas that you're selling to, all of that stuff. It's going to be all over the board. So you're going to take that, and you need to dissect each of those progress signals and those wins to really figure out, okay, this is our pathway forward. And that's the distribution portion of it that a lot of people miss. So I really like how
Yeah.
you brought that up, because that's a mindset shift that people need to make when they're first time founders or early stage founders and are getting signals from the marketplace. Don't confuse those signals for the wrong thing.
And it's not to say that they can't make traction in the marketplace. It's just that those aren't the signals of that. To your point, a sign of an actual signal of traction in the marketplace would be you get that information from enough people and you realize there's a pattern that in those conversations, and maybe you build something that double downs on that pattern, and then you get even more business as a result of that. And then when you talk to those new customers, it just reinforces that original pattern, and then you keep doing that, and you go, now that's how you discover that you're getting closer to your product market fit. And that would actually be a determining factor of you're making traction in the market. So these signals, I think, they're not the signal that is indicative of traction in the market, but they're the signals you use to figure out how to get traction in the market. It's like crawl, then walk, then run. And this is you're still learning how to get up to crawl stage.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that's fine. Just acknowledge that. Yeah.
So it's I love how you brought out the crawl then walk then run point, because it ties directly into something that one of our mutuals, Ashley Foss of Atlassian, just posted about it today on LinkedIn, about how the overemphasis on just growth at all costs, get as many labels as possible, really actually ends up costing a lot of organizations, startup or otherwise, a ton, because you're bringing in all of these new labels by any means necessary when they might not be the right labels or persona or companies to even deal with. And I actually commented on there, and this ties into sort of the brand versus scale point that I mentioned earlier. I made a comment on our post that, you know, as a person that is native to the sales side of an organization, I get so many sideways looks when I tell people and sales professionals that you really need to slow down if you want to be really effective at building a sustainable footprint within your business, because your time should be spent really diagnosing and understanding, why is somebody buying from us? Why is this the right fit for them? And asking those questions so that you're getting more and more effective at winning those type of deals, instead of just trying to win every deal possible. And what Ashley's point about the cost of doing it the opposite way, where your growth at any cost, is that you churn those customers out. And the point that I made was, it's so much easier for you to get a bigger share of the wallet out of a customer that you already have, than it is to go ahead and get a new customer. So when you understand that, why aren't you spending more time in bringing the right customers on board and building a customer for life versus the customer for the renewal cycle? And that's a mistake that happens when you confuse early traction, confuse wins for early traction, and you over index on the product side of it, instead of focusing in on what you should be doing from a distribution perspective.
Well, yeah, as a marketer too, marketers are often the victims of companies that are building an exciting product for marketing, and then they completely shift directions as they mature, and you almost kind of feel burned, because if it's no longer in the direction of the use case that you originally bought it for, that they were so good at working with. And I'm sure other professions have similar situations, but it could cause brand damage. It can, which is a bit hard to actually quantify, but it's there. It's one of those like marketing tropes of like, I know that this billboard worked only because when I put the billboard up, this happens, and when I take it down, this doesn't happen. It's the only information that we have, you know. A lot of people forget that with just by getting all those different logos, it can actually uh, waste. It can really burn people to the point where you create unintentional brand damage, which is a very expensive problem to fix. The other thing is you also get a little bit of the too many cooks in the kitchen situation, too many conflicting views. And I know we just talked about it, distribution basically meaning you want to get more and more views and input, but that doesn't mean open the floodgates. You still need to be smart about it, in terms of like controlling. It needs to be a controlled flow of the amount of information you're taking in and from how many sources all at once, and also why why you're paying attention to these people. And you're going to have to pay attention to the wrong people to figure out who the listen to the right people are. But that's much harder to do when you have 100 people to sift through all at once versus 10 to sift through all at once. It's kind of like why a doctor might be hesitant to give you too many medications at once, because if the side effect is bad, they won't know which pill give you the side effect. That's the same reason with having too much early adopters is a thing. So I agree. Slowing down can actually be an incredible way to use your resources very well, especially for any VC-backed companies.
No, those are all good points, especially the point about you want to chunk this out and probably take a more manageable approach in terms of how your customer acquisition strategy is, and that makes a lot of sense. You can offload some of that lift through AI components, and I don't want to take the conversation down on the AI side of it, but there's something interesting that I want to point out. And when we're looking at the trade-offs between um, distribution distribution versus product, one of the things that I talked about or we mentioned earlier was you have a decision to make whether it's brand versus scale. And actually, when we look at brand versus scale as a choice that you make, that decision's actually being made for us already. It's
Yeah.
our the buyer universe is already making that decision. And here's what I mean. There's a recent survey that came out by Dentsu, and what they did is that they surveyed somewhere in the neighborhood of like 14,000 buyers in the B2B space, and really dug deep into buyer behavior. And this was over a period of years, and they have a rolling average of data that comes out. But what was interesting in the brand versus scale debate is that buyers are making decisions based off of the brand affinity of a particular product or service at to build their short list. So when we
Yeah.
are talking to early stage founders about, hey, there are decisions that you have to make, our argument would be you need to do those things that get you visibility as a startup founder that allows you to punch above your weight class amongst the big boys and gals in the world that you're competing in. Because if you don't have brand recognition, or you don't have an audience that even knows who you are or anything that you stand for, if you enter into a deal, it's going to be really difficult to get in, and you're probably getting in late, which is going to impact your win rate anyways. So when we're thinking about the distribution side, or the debate between distribution versus product, that brand conversation becomes really important, because it almost makes it a necessity for you to build in public and do those things that actually get you right in the customer world. Because if they're not aware of you, you're not on the list. um, there's a Hamilton reference in there where you want to be in the room where it happens. Well, if you're not being visible and you're not seeking customer input, you're never going to
Yeah.
be in the room where it happens, and you're an afterthought, and you're already behind.
Yeah, one of the things, so like a lot of my clients, when it comes to the community marketing side, community partnerships goes hand in hand because of exactly what you just explained. When you do partnerships, I often talk about it as building a community of logos and brands for your affinity. It's not just a community of fans and users of your product. I often tend to like, if your roadmap needs to be complementary to the roadmap of the companies that you're partnering with or trying to get as early adopters to go, look who uses us. Um, to every point you just mentioned, and if you get the wrong logos at that point, fine, you might get a short-term burst, but you're creating a very expensive, messy situation for your Evan, your community partnerships guy down the road, which then therefore has a ripple effect to every other department at your company. Because how am I supposed to feed you feedback from your distribution channels if I can no longer trust your distribution channels as feedback to be worthwhile, because we've now determined that the source is broken and I'm too busy trying to get you a new source. So in the meanwhile, your product development team is just flailing in the dark, trying to figure out what it is that they're actually building, for who and for what and why. So
So I want to sit on this community conversation really quickly, because one of the things that and you're the expert in the community space. I'm still kind of like new at that community portion of it, but I'm sure that there's a question that's out there in the audience that has to do with along the lines of, look, I'm a startup. Community is so far downstream that I can't worry about it right now. I need to focus on getting logos in. How would you respond to that sort of statement?
I would respectfully let them know that I understand why they think that that is a down the road thing, why they think it's an expensive thing. Also, actually, community is a lot less expensive than other types of marketing, contrary to popular belief. But community marketing, it's it's there is such a point as too early. Like, you don't have something shippable at all, right? Like, that's too early, right? If you are pre-launch, we can take money in exchange for giving someone this tool, yes, I would dare say that there's a good chance that what you're selling is too um it's too early for community. There are exceptions to that if you're doing like a waitlist play or something that's a little more commoditized, but generally speaking, that's the minimum threshold. That's very early in a business's existence. It's basically saying the minute you go to market with this is the same minute that community should be ready to go with you. So I often tell people, your community marketer, if you know you're going to turn on the buy now page on your website in April, bring them on in January or February. Any earlier than that might be a waste of your time, but like, that's about the earliest that most community marketers would say, I can start making an impact now, because we need time to do R&D, basically, as an individual within the lens of what we're doing for your business and for your audience, and the list goes on. The reason I bring this up is because community marketing is how you build thought leadership. Community marketing is how you build credibility. It's not just brand awareness and brand recognition, it's also brand legitimacy. And that community is so important for building brand legitimacy. I could do a TED talk as to how and why community does that.
So it's that's an interesting perspective. I think when I've approached community before, um, we definitely did it before we were pre ICP, but we took all of our early adopters and put them into our product development council, so that we actually could interview and get feedback from them in terms of the direction of where the product should go, and that informed like what features we focus on early on. And this
Mm-hmm.
was before we had identified our niche, and we used that as a springboard into a more formal community. But basically, when when I'm when I'm sort of integrating all the different things that we integrate, sales, marketing, partnerships, community, into a single unified motion into the market with content as its anchor, we actually created sort of a web where our early adopters were actually the early founding members of the community through the product development council, so that we could
Mm-hmm.
actually be much more targeted in how we build and what we build. What are your thoughts on that approach as a way to integrate it and probably run parallel streams across all the things that you're wanting to do as a startup founder?
I think that's a great approach. I think that's one of many correct ways to do this. There are things that I would do in addition to that, just to make sure that the juice really is worth the squeeze. Um, for example, when it comes to having an early adopter community, one that's more bordered, you're also focusing on the conversations that are happening in that space, whether it's in the one-on-one calls with those people or in the group calls, the feedback that you're getting. making content that elicits similar feedback or speaks to the problems that your product is solving, that they have mentioned, using this as a way to inspire content that you're making for your content marketing engine. It's a really good way for you to test what your brand's future TOV will be and POV will be. It's a great way to test, where do I double down on more expensive content marketing initiatives down the road and in the future? Because I think that people often forget is marketing alone is just turning out products, right? Marketing, every piece of content is a product, every single channel is a product. So we're developing products also. Marketers are developing products to market your company's products, basically. So by having this is our own marketing R&D of like, okay, well, now that you know to go build your product like this, I now know from that same exact conversation what to say to get people to care about you or to remember you or to stop and listen for a second and hear you out. I now know why this person cares about this. Now, granted, they may have found you through a friend or a friend of a friend, or you just got really lucky and you struck a chord of them. But either way, there's going to be information there that they're giving you for the intention of improving your roadmap that I, the marketer, can use to get more thems, to get more adjacent to thems. That's why community is never too early.
So there's something that I want to highlight in what you mentioned that I think is really important for anybody to pay attention to, and that's your point about you hear and see patterns happening in these conversations. You can look at that as internal validation of a theory that you have. But the part that I really like about what you just mentioned is that you have to take that and push that out into the marketplace and get external validation from your potential customer base. So that rapid deployment and testing piece is deployment isn't the right word, but the rapid testing and iteration piece is really important when you're in these early stages and when we're having that distribution versus product conversation. That is a distribution motion that you're talking about. You're going to hear things from your early adopters if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing in terms of win reviews and things like that. And then once those patterns start to emerge, you need to validate that against the broader market. And you and I have both talked about this on different occasions, where that validation exercise, if you get signals from the broader market based off of feedback that you've got from existing and early adopters, that tells you if you're on the right track or if this track is a dead end, because your external signals will tell you if this is meaningful or not. This is how you take a year-long roadmap and you turn it into like a 2-week sprint, because you get feedback, you populate it externally based on the signals that you get will determine whether what you have is real or not, and then you move on to the next thing. That cadence really helps you speed up your ability to get to viability and traction.
And there's a lot of ways to make this faster, and there's a reason why there's a lot of fractional community marketers now, is because we have the ability to do this much faster than we were able to do before. Typically, what I would consider doing is, if I was doing this at a company, every time they have a call with somebody, I hope that they're using like Gong or Fathom or any sort of recording software of some way, shape, or form, and their emails, so they're doing any outbound or anything, something sync into some CRM somewhere or some sales engagement tool somewhere. If they're using a social media management tool or a social listening tool, I'm sure that they're tracking some sort of sentiment with those things. The point being, you have a lot of different data already, at least for that stage, relatively a lot, that kind of tells you why people are there, even if that's not what you're asking, right? You're asking them like, hey, what do you think of the product? Well, in that answer, they're going to say why they're there without thinking about saying that answer. A good marketer knows how to do that. Well, to do that at scale, you can just go grab like a tool like Elu, and you can build an AI agent with AI in seconds that just cross-references all the bits of information I just mentioned. And then you can say, find me all the patterns and why someone cares about what we build. And then ta-da, here's a report now. And then I can use that to create a content strategy to then double down on what you just said. And so that alone could take a marketer 2 to 3 weeks pre-AI. Now it can take you seconds to do it. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that a business tends to forget, and I think it's because community did used to be a very expensive thing to do. And don't get me wrong, it can still be a very expensive, big investment, but with AI and there being community marketers that now specialize or early stage like myself, there is a lower cost barrier to entry to reap the benefits and the rewards of community as a way to help solve the distribution versus product dilemma.
So everything that you mentioned is really solid. I would
It's almost
wager
like
that
I do
there,
this for a living.
yeah, shocker.
I'm just
The
cosplaying as somebody who knows what they're talking about.
the thing that I want to call out is this, because I'm sure there are people that are going to catch this either right now or on the replays, and they're going to be like, this stuff is really fluffy. How is this going to move the needle in terms of my ability to get traction in the marketplace? All of these sort of questions that are like, what's the ROI in this? And what's interesting about that question, and we'll post this in the show notes or in the comments. The Dentsu study actually spoke directly to this. And one of the things that they identified in their interviews with buyers is that those buyers who built out their short lists with brands that they were already familiar with or had a sense with before they actually even went to market. So in order to make the list, you need to be on the brand on the buyer's radar. So that meant that their list of 3 to 5 top companies that they're going to interview or evaluate as vendors, they only made the list because they had brand visibility and they were familiar with the brand before they went to market. But here's the other thing that's important. Because of the experience that they had with these brands, one of the survey points was, if that brand made a strong first impression, what did it mean in terms of deal cycle? And the answer to that question is those brands that actually had a strong brand presence and strong first impression were able to shorten their deal cycle by 16 weeks, not 16%, 16 weeks. So when founders are sitting there thinking about how do I get traction in the marketplace quickly, here's where the focus on distribution ends up paying off. You can shorten your decision cycle by 16 weeks by emphasizing brand, by emphasizing experience, versus what typically happens in sales driven organizations is growth at all costs. Let's push people through the funnel. And that's the interesting piece about this, is that sellers and sales leaders will always look sideways at these marketing conversations. And I'm a seller. I'm somebody that's been on the revenue side my entire career. I'm just an oddball in that space.
I don't
But
think
we
we
know,
would get along though if you acted like those types.
no,
No,
and,
bluntly.
but
Yeah.
this is where it's important. Like when you're, and this is what's frustrating about being in the B2B space, is that you legit have customers telling you how they want you to sell to them, and sales by and large ignores it and says, let's just do more of what we're already doing, but just strap more horsepower to it so that we can have crappy results at scale. It blows my mind.
I want to get on a t-shirt. Like I want to make a merch store of just like crappy results at scale as like one of the shirts. Like, just because that is the most important thing that I have. That's one of the best. That needs to be somewhere in your LinkedIn headline, Dr. Jim. Like, stop having crappy results at scale. Like, I don't know what it is, but we'll workshop it. But that really is, as a marketer, that's how it feels. It's also incredibly frustrating as a marketer to hear these things, because it's like we are on the same page in terms of what the desired outcome is. Like, we agree with the goal. The goal is not the issue. It's typically the debating on how to get to the goal. And the I always find comical is that the approach that I am encouraging people to do typically results in a higher ROI or success rate in the same amount of time than the alternative. It just doesn't feel like that, look like that, or sound like that straight out the gate. And I often remind people, with the growth at all cost mindset, you might see a line that's a little more like this, where like with what the mindset that we're talking about, it's a little more curved and then it spikes up towards the very last second. At the end of the day, though, it's still gonna get there, probably around the exact same time. The difference is the chances of it getting there are much higher because it's a much more sustainable, methodical, and well-informed approach. The second thing is the chapter two, whatever happens after you've hit that goal, right? It's just to get in. Maybe your seed stage, and you're just trying to get enough traction to prove why you should get your A or your B, right? That information will actually be of use, and you'll have less mess to clean up and more fuel to go forward with. Because there's always going to be mess to clean up, but it'll be less messy.
So there's something in what you just said that reminded me of something that Mark Cuban recently commented on. So one of the things he's always being asked to look into the future and predict what's going to happen in the business world. And one of the things that he mentioned in a recent interview, and I forget where he was interviewed on this, but he said within the next 18 to 36 months, you're going to see content explode into the marketplace at such a level, and this is AI driven content, that buyers are going to have a hard time figuring out what's real and what isn't. Am I dealing with a real person when I look at their or consume this content? And what's interesting about Cuban's observation on that is that he said that provides an important lesson for anybody that's in a B2B or even B2C space when it comes to selling. Because what's gonna drive buyer behavior is this: if I can't tell what I'm viewing in a virtual world as real, I'm going to need to go back to doing those things that are truly human and one-on-one connections. And here's where all of that stuff ties together. We're having this conversation about production, distribution versus product. And the reason why that choice is laid out this way is that your buyers are already making that decision for you. They're already seeking out those experiences that are uniquely human, that allow them to feel seen and heard and understood, and their problems are validated in a human way. And what do we see the B2B space doing? They're doubling and tripling down on the volume play instead of listening to what the market is saying, which is a really interesting, as the kids say, that's a weird flex, bro. And it's it's the complete opposite direction that you should be going. But think about that.
Yeah.
Early on in the show, we talked about, it's brand versus scale, experience versus sales, community versus commodity. Those choices are distinct choices between, are you being human or are you being just, some computer generated bot? Like, what are you doing that's bot related versus human related? And Cuban's comments point directly to encouraging people to do things that are uniquely human, that's going to connect you with the buyer.
Well, because even in a world of AI generated slop, there's still going to be a need for human validation of something working the way that people claim it's supposed to, right? Reviews are still going to be a thing. And as people don't stop trusting certain sources for reviews, well, then word of mouth will replace that, because you can't replace the word of mouth bit. Humans are going to talk. That's in our nature as a species. We're a social creature. We're going to tell other people about our experiences of things. And if we can't trust the internet, then the marketer and the company is going to go, well, if they're not going to trust online reviews because they don't know if they're AI or not, then how are they going to trust anybody? They're going to be in calls. They're going to be, now you got platforms like YouTube and stuff that are now experimenting with requiring you to show how much AI was used in your video. Like this video is sponsored or whatever. There might not be things where like this speaker is AI generated, this script is AI generated. We're already months, weeks away from that sort of play being added, and we don't even have to wait for legislation for that. Platforms are doing that on their own free accord and will. And probably somebody's like, well, why would YouTube want to do that? Because it's going to hurt their business model. Actually, it'll make YouTube a reliable source of information, which will make people want to keep coming to YouTube. So it's in YouTube's best interest. This whole rant is just a way to remind people that if you were to focus more on distribution and focus on the humanity parts of it now, you're ahead of the curve for an inevitable shit show that you mentioned is coming soon. And I've
The
heard the same prediction by so many other people. So he's not alone and you're not alone.
the interesting thing about what you just mentioned, where you're talking about AI generated slop and its impact on buyer perception and trust, is that already before that's hit the marketplace, customers are already saying, and this comes out from that Dentsu survey too. So again,
I need
people
to
need
read
to.
that survey.
It's freaking gold, because what they're saying from the buyer's perspective, 71% of buyers feel like they're not being heard or understood in the buying process by the vendors that they deal with. But when you ask marketers and sellers about their perception of how good a job that they're doing, 71% of them feel like they're doing a great job. That's a massive disconnect in terms of what people on our side of the house feel about the job that we're doing compared to customer perceptions. And this actually flows all the way through the buyer journey. So buyers are going through the buyer journey, even with their short list of of vendors that they've selected based on brand experience, and are still feeling unheard in terms of those vendors really understanding what their day-to-day looks like. That's a massive problem. You made the short list because you made a good brand impression, and buyers are still feeling like they're being ignored. And then when it comes to implementation, the data in there shows that only 39% of buyers are satisfied with the vendor that they selected in terms of that vendor's ability to meet them at their unique needs within the organization. So again, if you're just going to throw automation against all of that, you're going to continue to get these crappy results. It's just going to be super powered crappy results
Yeah.
that you get.
Yeah, it
And
was a bad process. Add automation is just an automated bad process.
yeah, and it's, I think the challenge becomes, how do we get, you know, founders, CEOs, sales leaders to actually pay attention to what's being written and said in plain English, and say, oh, and consider, oh, well, maybe we need to shift gears. That's I think the frustration that both you and I have, is that you get all this input from customers on how they want to be sold to, how they want to be talked to, how they want to actually experience this. And the response is usually a shrug shoulders. Yeah, that's great, but let me tell you about this thing. Let me tell you about this new feature that we've launched.
Because
So
they don't want to admit that they don't know how to do something, and they need someone to help them know how to do it, which, by the way, is why this episode should be sponsored by BetterHelp. Which that's a future episode to talk about mental health being a big part of this as well. But I do think a part of it is self-esteem. Personally, like if I had to bet money, it's ego.
While we're on the topic of mental health or actually navigating complex environments, how are you celebrating being on the brink of World War III?
Well, like I mentioned, I did have to miss an all hands meeting last week to practice grenade throwing with Mariah Carey and the gays. My feet really hurt. I don't know why we chose those shoes, but we're going with them. The irony, though, that I'm not even qualified for the draft for the amount of mental health conditions that I have. So...
I think when we're on the topic of a potential draft, and for those that are watching and wondering what direction did this just take, we've made a deliberate decision in each of these shows to throw in a random current events, world events, or geopolitical
I don't even know if it's
events to talk about.
so much as we know it's going to happen, and we've just decided to stop fighting the urge.
Yeah. What's interesting, and I think you and I are both safe, is that in the current world, in this current regime's desires for who should be in their armed forces, you and I aren't part of the equation, so we're safe.
I'm young enough, but they would have to really lower the standards to allow me to do anything. Like, I'm not even allowed to buy a gun based on my mental health conditions. So you want me to use one to defend the country? Like, I'm not even allowed to apply. I'm not allowed to enlist voluntarily.
I mean,
So,
I think I'm beyond the shelf life of what would be a
I think
standard
it's like
enlistment. So
35.
yeah,
But then
so
again,
like
the Constitution doesn't matter now, so why would it matter during the draft?
right. So getting back on track. So when we're talking about, you know, these are the choices that you have to make. I think one of the interesting things that comes out of this discussion is that, you know, you can succeed, and I think you referenced it based on the growth trajectory that you talked about. You can
Yeah.
succeed picking either side.
Yeah,
Um,
assuming your company lives through World War III, you'll be fine.
yeah, you can succeed picking either side, making that assumption, assuming that we're not living on a cinder. Um,
If you are opening a startup right now in New Zealand, you are doing great. Ain't nobody gonna bother you and your goats. So
that's not a bad idea. I wonder what the startup community in New Zealand looks like. I think one of the things that you pointed out in what that growth trajectory looks like is, you know, how do you want to grow? But the bigger question is, what's your sustainability plan? Because if your plan, if you make those choices and your choice, you go on the side of growth at all costs, there's going to be a sustainability issue because you're going to be constantly churning and not really optimizing your customer base for long-term results.
it's wildly frustrating as well on a personal note as somebody who is usually 15 to 20 years younger than the people I have to say this to. And stereotypically, I should be the one that wants the instant gratification, but like that's not the case. Um, it's I setting marketers that I often get asked by people that like how do I deal with those founders? You can only do so much to show people statistics and proof. I think the real lesson is going to come from there being more examples, and there will be, and there has been, but an increase in public failure of doing this incorrectly. One of my favorite things about this, I wouldn't say trend, but the rise of the importance of building in public is the inevitable failing in public that comes with that. And either through the means of like everyone, failure is normal. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but those that ignore these signals and are building in public, they're going to fail in public. And even if they're quiet about it, it's going to be obvious because people like you and me are going to be able to just look back at all of their building in public content and go, well, here's where you went wrong. You don't even have to say it. We already know because we were paying attention. Um, it's like the Titanic going towards the iceberg, and we're saying, "Hey, you're heading towards an iceberg," and then the next post, "Hey, you're still headed towards the iceberg." Next post, "Hey, you're heading towards the iceberg," and then there's no post after that. Oh, I guess they hit the iceberg. Like you
Yeah,
don't even have to tell us you hit the iceberg. We're just gonna know that that's what happened.
the your point about failing in public though, that's instructive too, because the faster you can do that, the better off you can be, because that way you're not getting false positives and taking the wrong signals. So you want to build in public. And I mean, it's a startup mantra or cliche at this
Yeah,
point: fail fast, fail often, fail forward. So the quicker
yeah,
that you can go through that fail cycle, the quicker you can get to actually really solid traction.
and
That's
well, there's ways you can
why,
learn
yeah,
ahead. Look at like so Sahil. He's one of the founders. He's more the go-to-market type founder for a SaaS startup called Talent Pluto. If you're a nerd for like AI and for the sales world and the hiring space, look up Talent Pluto. Even if you're not looking to buy it, it's cool. Not sponsored. I just think it's a cool product. But anyway, Sahil's like my age. I think he's actually a little bit younger than me. So, I'm 30. I turned 31 on the 23rd. The reason I bring this up is because it's not like the man's got 16 startups under his belt's worth of experience, right? Like, he hasn't been physically alive long enough to have anecdotes that we're talking about to learn from, right? But what Sahil does very well is he is a serial networker and he knows a wide variety of people that he can get different perspectives from and learn from their mistakes. he's balancing his network very well with like having young people that are just as like, starry-eyed, hope-filled because they're still new and unbiased to all this, while also putting himself in the same room as people that are literally old enough to be his parents so he can listen and learn from their mistakes. And he's paying attention to the founders that are building in public that are more senior than him in the industry. He's doing a very good job of this. So I don't want anybody to think that you even necessarily have to fail at this in order to succeed. Somebody else can fail at this in order for you to succeed, as long as you're paying attention.
Yeah, no, that's a good call out, and I'll check out the Talent Pluto. I'd never heard of them, so I have their page
Community
pulled up right now.
marketers are also, by the way, are a really good way for you to pay attention to those things without spreading your bandwidth too full, because the amount of founders that say, hey, I know it's not in your JD to do this specific thing, but since you're already doing all this social listening as a part of your job, can you see what the trends are in our competitors' struggles and failures and those founders are while you're at it? Because it's going to be in the same places. It's like, while I'm already here, I might as well like look at this. I'm already going to the store to grab milk and eggs. I might as well grab bread while I'm at it. It's one of those things. So, talk to your community marketer. A lot of them will have no problem at all adding that, like, well, hey, just so you know, this company, a lookalike of some way, shape, or form, or somebody your audience also cares about, is struggling because they made this mistake in public. Let's not do that. Like, it just so simple. But I understand that founders don't have the time to scroll through social media as much as I am paid to. So, and that's where you can use AI also. Like I mentioned Elu earlier, also not sponsored, but wouldn't be mad about it.
Yeah. So let's TLDR this. So from your perspective, when we're looking at the debate, in our minds, it's not much of a debate, but when you're making the decision or the choice between product and distribution, what's the biggest reason you would cite and tell founders that they need to emphasize distribution over product?
It's confidence in your product roadmap. That's like the number one. Yeah.
So if I'm thinking about that same question and I'm making the case why people need to emphasize distribution over product, I'll put it this way. Every person that you talk to needs to have an experience with you. They need to feel what you do and what you're about and what your brand is about. You're not going to get that by focusing on the product side of the equation. When you're talking about product versus distribution, you need to think in terms of experience. How is your customer connecting with you? How are you connecting with your customer? And if you're only focused on products and features, you're never going to make that connection. You're just going to be in a transactional space. And that's why the emphasis on distribution needs to be front of mind, especially when you're trying to get to traction. So that's the that's the key takeaway from each of our sides. So when we look at next week, what are we going to talk about next week, Brain?
Hiring. We're talking about
you totally didn't get that reference either.
We should. No, wait, what? There was a reference made?
So there was a reference made. I called you Brain because this is like Pinky and the Brain from Tiny Toons. Never mind. Look it up later. So next week, what are we gonna...
Welcome to Go to Market Madness, where Dr. Jim is constantly reminded of the generational divide.
So next week, we're going to talk about hiring. So what about hiring are we going to talk about?
Hire people that are old enough to know the Pinky and the Brain reference.
I second that. So next week we're
very pro ageism here. I'm kidding. Someone please don't flip that.
So next week we're going to talk about hiring and how you hire appropriate for the stage that you're in as a startup. So that should be a good conversation.
Yeah, it's just going to be a giant pitch of me.
I mean,
no, you're not here. I don't know why.
No, I think it should be good. We're going to be digging into what are some of the mistakes that startup founders make in terms of their hiring plan and how you can look at some of these things differently to get the most bang for your buck. So that'll be a good show for people to check out.
And also, I will say, I hope that people that are also looking to break into working for more early stage startups check it out as well, because I think that if you reverse engineer a lot of what we're saying, you can use it as a way to get your foot in the door. And you and I know we can save this ramble for the actual episode, but to work in early stage startups is heavy on networking and less on applying, because usually the posts don't, there's no job post. It's a lot of, oh, you exist. Oh, I like what you do. Maybe we should work together. It's a lot of that.
Yeah.
And if it's not that, it's a founder asking another founder in a different company, who do you know does this? It's very rarely put up a job posting.
Yeah.
And I think people forget the reason why is mainly because like they're either going to get too many things in and it's gonna be overwhelming and they can't handle it, or they haven't had the time to invest in employer branding yet. So to advertise a post and then to compete with all these other job posts in the marketplace, it just the juice ain't worth the squeeze for them. It makes more sense for them to go the give me a referral route, or the I stumble upon somebody that like I want to grab them while they're available to be grabbed.
Yeah.
Play. So I think that if you're a founder who's never thought about that, definitely listen to that episode when it comes out or for the recording after. And if you're somebody who works for people like that or wants to, you should also listen, because we're going to be talking about it from their perspective most of all. And you should be able to reverse engineer that quite simply.
Good stuff. All right. So I think we'll call that one a wrap. And then we will see you next week at 2:00 Central Time. And we're going to talk hiring in the startup world.
Yep. And on that note, also a happy Pride from Evan, the other Evan, who regularly gets mistaken for me on LinkedIn, and I do of him, just because of our names.
That is not a thing that I have to worry about.
Yes. Your last name's Smith, correct?
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
Bye.